In this explosive courtroom drama, we uncover a hidden legal battle that pits the highest authority in the state against a struggling mother of two who just wanted a roof over her head. What makes this case so shocking is not just who was involved, but what was revealed behind those courtroom doors. Stick around until the very end, because this case was buried from the public eye and labeled as one of the secret Judge Judy files. What happens in this courtroom will leave you stunned, and the final judgment will shake the very foundation of justice. This is the case that never made it to video until now. The courtroom fell into a hush as the doors creaked open, and in walked the woman whose eviction had ignited shockwaves through the city. Her name was Denise Carter. A single mother of two, she stood tall despite the weight on her shoulders. Her clothes were modest. Her eyes carried weeks of sleepless nights. But there was one thing in her posture that screamed louder than any lawyer in the room. She was not here to back down. Judge Judy adjusted her glasses and looked over the bench with a sharp eye. She had seen many cases, but the presence of two armed state troopers in the gallery, standing just outside the rows of benches, signaled something heavier than usual, something political, something buried. The bailiff called out in a steady voice, "This court is now in session." The Honorable Judge Judy presiding. Denise sat at the plaintiff's table, next to a clean-cut man in a navy blue suit. His name was David Reynolds, a civil rights attorney who had spent the past decade taking on government overreach. He had flown back from a federal case in New York just to take this one. Across the room, on the defense side, sat Governor Matthew Caldwell. Dressed in a fitted grey suit, he carried the air of someone who had grown too used to having doors opened for him. Behind him sat his attorney, Cheryl Lawson. She had the calm, unreadable face of someone paid very well to make messes disappear. Judge Judy looked at the file in front of her. Then she lifted her eyes to Denise. "Miss Carter, this court is here to understand what happened the night you were removed from your home. You claim there was no notice, no paperwork, and no reason given. Is that correct?" Denise nodded once. "That is correct, Your Honor. I was evicted in the middle of the night with no warning. I was not even given time to get my children's school supplies." Judge Judy's eyebrows raised slightly. She turned to David Reynolds. "Mr. Reynolds, is your client prepared to testify under oath that the eviction was conducted without legal documentation or official notice?" David responded clearly, "Yes, Your Honor. We also have video footage from a neighbor and a notarized letter from the building manager stating that no legal orders were served before the eviction took place." Cheryl Lawson stood immediately. "Your Honor, we move to dismiss this entire proceeding. The Governor of California cannot be expected to answer civil claims of this nature while in office. He has executive immunity." Judge Judy's voice dropped an octave. Calm but sharp. "Miss Lawson, you are not here to teach this court about immunity. You are here to explain why a mother was removed from her home with no paperwork and 2 state police cruisers in the alley behind her building. Cheryl opened her mouth but hesitated. Judge Judy continued, "This court does not play politics. If your client misused his authority to violate housing law, we will get to the truth of it. Now sit down." The courtroom murmured with low voices. Denise closed her eyes for a moment. For the first time in weeks, she felt like someone was listening. Judge Judy tapped her gavel once. "Proceed with opening statements." David Reynolds stood up. He did not walk around or perform theatrics. He simply stood still and spoke directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here because a mother was removed from her apartment without notice. She lived in that home for 6 years. She paid rent. She raised 2 sons. And then, one evening, a black SUV pulled up. Men with clipboards and guns arrived. And within an hour she was homeless. This was not just a housing dispute. This was an abuse of executive power. And the person sitting across from us did not act alone. But he did authorize the move. Governor Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. David continued, "We will show emails. We will present witness testimony. And we will lay out the connection between a construction contract signed 2 days before the eviction and the governor's campaign donors." Judge Judy watched carefully. She said nothing. Not yet. Cheryl Lawson stood for her side. "Your Honor, this case is political theater. The plaintiff's home was located in a zone already cleared for redevelopment. All tenants received notice. Miss Carter failed to respond. The governor has no direct involvement in operational matters of individual evictions." Judge Judy spoke again. "Then explain to this court why Miss Carter's name appears in a spreadsheet marked confidential. A spreadsheet pulled directly from the governor's office the day after the eviction." Cheryl hesitated. The courtroom leaned in. Denise whispered to David, "She has no answer." She did not expect that file to get out. David whispered back, "And it was not just luck. We had a whistleblower." Judge Judy turned to Denise. "Miss Carter, tell this court what happened the night you were removed." Denise stood slowly. Her voice was steady, though her hands were locked together tightly. "It was just after 9 at night. My boys were finishing homework. Someone knocked. Then someone used a key. 3 men entered. One wore a badge. The others wore suits. They told me to pack a bag and get out. They said they were under state authority." She paused. "I asked where the notice was. They said it was not required. They said this came from higher up." Judge Judy leaned forward. "Higher up. Did they use that phrase?" "Yes." "Exactly that. I asked again, and one man said this came from the top. He said that twice." Cheryl Lawson stood again. "Objection." "Hearsay." Judge Judy nodded slightly. "Sustained, but noted." Denise continued, "I left with a trash bag of clothes and my 2 kids in tears. The next morning my apartment door had a padlock. My name was scratched off the mailbox, like I was never there." The room was silent. Judge Judy turned to the governor. "Governor Caldwell, This court will hear from you directly, not your attorney, not your aides. If you are named in an official eviction file, and if it can be traced back to your office, you will speak to it. Is that clear? Governor Caldwell cleared his throat. I did not authorize the eviction of any individual tenant. My office processes thousands of housing adjustments per year. This is routine. Judge Judy tapped her pen once on the bench, then explained the signature on the memo attached to Miss Carter's address. It bears your full name. Governor Caldwell opened his mouth, closed it, then looked at Cheryl. She did not look back. Judge Judy turned to the court clerk. Mark this file for review. We will reconvene for witness testimony in the next session. And just like that, the room erupted with quiet chaos. Journalists scribbled notes. State officials exchanged glances. And Denise Carter sat back down, holding her breath. Because this was no longer just about her apartment. This was about how high people were willing to go to hide the truth. And Judge Judy was only just getting started. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the courtroom as the second day of the hearing began. The air was tense. Journalists sat in the back row with notebooks ready. The cameras had been banned by Judge Judy herself. She did not want theatrics. She wanted truth. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Judy entered with the same piercing energy she carried the day before. No robe could make her command the room, any more than she already did. She glanced once at Denise Carter, then to Governor Caldwell. Then she raised a sheet of paper. This court will now call its first witness. David Reynolds stood. Your Honor, the plaintiff calls James Whittaker to the stand. The doors opened. A man in his early 50s walked in. He wore a janitor's uniform. His name tag was visible. James Whittaker, building superintendent. He took the stand and placed his hand on the Bible. His eyes looked tired, but honest. The bailiff gave the oath. James nodded. Judge Judy looked him in the eye. Mr. Whittaker, you are the superintendent of the building where Miss Carter lived. Yes, Your Honor. Been there 12 years. Tell this court what happened the night she was removed. James cleared his throat. The whole courtroom leaned in. It was about 9:30. I was in the basement checking the furnace. That building old. Needs eyes on it. I got a call on my work phone. Said state personnel were on site. Said to stand down. That ain't usual. Judge Judy interrupted. Who called you? James took a breath. Number was blocked. But the voice was firm. Said this was an emergency order. Told me to stay out of the way. I thought maybe it was police business. I did not ask too many questions. Did you see the eviction take place? Yes, ma'am. From the basement stairs. I saw 2 men escorting Miss Carter and her boys out. No boxes. Just bags. She was crying. The boys looked scared. They did not knock. They just entered. And did you see any official paperwork? No, ma'am. None. Usually I get a notice, a court order copy. But not this time. David Reynolds walked slowly toward the witness box. Mr. Whittaker. Did you later find any evidence in the building that might explain what happened? James nodded. Yes, sir. Next morning I went up to clean the hallway. Found a folder by the trash chute. Had state seals on it. But the weird thing was the top page. It said Project Clearance Phase 1. Had a list of 6 tenants. Only Miss Carter's name was crossed off in red ink. David turned to the court. Your Honor, we have that folder. It has been entered into evidence. Judge Judy lifted her hand. Clerk, bring the folder. The courtroom watched as a thick brown folder was handed up to the bench. Judy flipped it open. Her eyes narrowed. Governor Caldwell, do you recognize this document? The governor did not answer right away. Cheryl Lawson whispered something to him. But Judge Judy raised a finger. No coaching. I want to hear it from him. The governor spoke carefully. That appears to be part of a redevelopment review. My office receives hundreds of such documents. Judge Judy nodded slowly. Then tell this court why your initials appear on the bottom of the last page. Cheryl stood. Your Honor, we request a short recess to review the authenticity of this document. Denied. Judge Judy's voice echoed. This court will not delay justice to give spin time to a defense team. You have the document. You have the witness. Proceed. David Reynolds nodded. Your Honor, we call our second witness. Megan Holloway. The courtroom turned again as a young woman in a green blazer walked in. Her hair was tied back. Her steps were quick. She looked like someone used to running from place to place. She was a junior policy aide, a name not many knew. But she had worked in the governor's office. She sat down at the witness box and took the oath. Then she looked directly at Judge Judy. Miss Holloway, tell this court why you contacted our office 3 weeks ago. Because I saw something I could not ignore. I was asked to shred a document with names on it. Red ink. Top secret header. The name Denise Carter was on the list. I knew something was wrong. Cheryl Lawson stood again. Your Honor, this is all speculation. Judge Judy raised her hand. Sit down, Miss Lawson. Let her speak. Megan continued. I kept a copy. It matched the folder from the building. I also saw internal emails from senior staff. It was not about safety. It was about getting certain tenants out before donors arrived to tour the site. David asked, did any of those emails mention the governor directly? Yes. One said governor wants clean slate before press visit. Judge Judy leaned in. Miss Holloway, are you willing to submit those emails to this court under oath? Yes, Your Honor. I already have. Sent them last night to your clerk. The clerk nodded. Judge Judy tapped her pen again. She looked at Governor Caldwell. Governor, you now have a sworn witness from your office, confirming that your team cleared tenants based on visibility before a political event. Governor Caldwell said nothing. The room was quiet. Nobody moved. Denise Carter put her hands to her mouth. Her body trembled. Judge Judy finally spoke. We are no longer talking about a clerical error. We are no longer talking about miscommunication. We are talking about targeted displacement for political gain. and this court will not tolerate that." She stood up. "We will reconvene tomorrow for cross-examination. But let it be known, this case has now entered the phase of full accountability." Court dismissed. As the room emptied, the whispers turned to phone calls. Reporters left in a blur. And somewhere in a downtown office, a press secretary realized the storm was only beginning. And Denise just sat still, breathing, crying silently. Because someone had finally said the truth out loud. And that changed everything. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Judge Judy's gavel came down sharply, signaling the beginning of the third day of the hearing. The public gallery was packed again, filled with spectators eager to witness the drama unfold. Today, all eyes were on one person, Governor Thomas Caldwell. It was rare for a sitting governor to be called to testify in a courtroom, but here he was, walking in with his usual calm, a steely confidence radiating off him. His tailored suit looked immaculate, as always. He appeared composed, but anyone with sharp eyes could see the tension behind his eyes, the slight tightness in his jaw. The courtroom fell silent as he approached the witness stand. Judge Judy watched him intently, her gaze never wavering, as he took the oath. "Governor Caldwell, take a seat." He sat, adjusting his tie, then cleared his throat. Judge Judy didn't waste time. "Governor, it has come to the court's attention that your office was involved in the sudden and unexplained eviction of Miss Denise Carter from her residence. Despite her having no prior notice, and despite no legal grounds for such an action. Would you care to explain yourself?" The governor looked around the room before addressing the judge. "Your Honor, I'm aware of the situation. But let me clarify that my office wasn't directly involved in the removal of Miss Carter. I can assure you that any actions taken were for the greater good, based on city planning and redevelopment initiatives that I fully stand behind." There was a collective murmur in the room. Some spectators exchanged skeptical looks, while others leaned forward in their seats. Judge Judy leaned forward too, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Greater good. You're telling me that a black mother and her children, living in that building for years, were uprooted for the greater good?" Governor Caldwell maintained his calm demeanor. "It's more complicated than that, Your Honor. There are long-term plans for this area, and we've been working with various stakeholders to revitalize the neighborhood. Unfortunately, some tenants needed to be relocated to make room for future developments." Judge Judy raised an eyebrow. "I see. And who exactly are these stakeholders you mention? Could you provide their names, please?" The governor hesitated. It wasn't the question he had expected. "Well, the redevelopment project involves several private investors. There are plans to build new housing, parks, and improve infrastructure. These are projects that will benefit the community. But are these projects benefiting the people who already live there?" Judge Judy's words were sharp and direct. "Governor, Miss Carter, and others like her, did not ask for this redevelopment. They were already residents. They didn't ask to be part of your so-called greater good. They were simply pushed out. And you didn't even give them a choice. The governor shifted in his seat, trying to maintain his composure. Your Honor, my office has always prioritized community development. I believe in progress. Sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good. Miss Carter's eviction was part of that, unfortunate as it may be. But I assure you, it was in no way meant to target her or any specific group. At that moment, David Reynolds stood up. Governor, are you telling this court that Miss Carter, a mother with 2 children, was simply a casualty of progress? A necessary evil for your redevelopment plans? Governor Caldwell shifted in his chair, visibly uncomfortable with the directness of the question. It wasn't like that. It was a part of the larger vision. There are always some unfortunate consequences when trying to create a better future. Sometimes people have to make way for the bigger picture. David Reynolds stepped forward, not letting the governor off the hook. Is that so? And what would you say to the allegations from your staff member, Megan Holloway, who claims to have seen internal emails that suggest this was all done for political reasons? That tenants, like Miss Carter, were removed simply because they didn't fit the narrative you wanted to present for an upcoming event. Governor Caldwell's face darkened. I do not know what Miss Holloway is talking about. She is simply a junior aide. Her claims are baseless. But Judge Judy wasn't buying it. Governor, the evidence has already been presented. Miss Holloway's testimony is not baseless. You've already been linked to this scandal. The emails, the documents, the testimony from the building superintendent. We have everything we need to prove that this was not simply a case of progress, as you call it. This was a deliberate action aimed at removing a black mother for your own political gain. The governor was caught. He sat motionless for a moment, as though the weight of his words and his actions finally sunk in. Judge Judy's voice rang out in the silence. Governor, I don't believe you. And I don't think this court believes you either. Your office, your people, have caused harm, and now we are going to hold you accountable. The governor's lips tightened. He remained silent. David Reynolds pressed on. Governor, you mentioned earlier that your office wasn't directly involved in the eviction. Is that still your stance? Or do you now admit that your office was complicit in Miss Carter's forced relocation? Governor Caldwell's gaze was steady, but his voice faltered just a little. I suppose we were complicit, but it wasn't intentional. David Reynolds didn't let up. Was it also not intentional when you signed off on Project Clearance Phase 1, the document that was found at the building? Was it not intentional when your staff member, Megan Holloway, said you wanted a clean slate before a press visit? Governor Caldwell looked at Judge Judy, his face pale. I didn't know. I didn't realize the extent of what was going on. but I now see how damaging it was. Judge Judy's voice softened, but it still held the weight of authority. Now you see. But it's too late for that. You may not have known, but that's your fault. You're the one in charge. You should have known. And now you're going to answer for it. David Reynolds turned back to the court. Your Honor, we would like to enter the governor's testimony into the record. This is a confession. It is no longer a matter of not knowing. The governor's office was complicit, and we demand justice for Miss Denise Carter and all the others who were affected. Judge Judy nodded. The governor has spoken. His words will be recorded. But this case is not finished. We will continue. The truth will be revealed, and those responsible will face consequences. This court stands adjourned for the day. As the gavel struck, the courtroom erupted with quiet conversations, murmurs of disbelief and anticipation. The governor's confession had been made, but it was far from the end. There was still much more to uncover. Denise Carter, sitting in the front row, exhaled. Her heart pounded. She had known this day would come. She had known the truth would surface. But hearing the governor's words in front of everyone still felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Justice was coming. She could feel it. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension as the next day of the trial began. The governor's testimony had left a mark on everyone. But the trial was far from over. Judge Judy had already made it clear that the truth would come to light, and she would not rest until justice was served. Today, it was time for another shocking witness to take the stand. The defendant's legal team had called in a surprise witness, one that would send shockwaves through the courtroom. As the courtroom settled, everyone turned their attention to the door as the witness entered. A woman in her mid-30s walked in confidently, her posture straight and composed. But there was something in her eyes, something that made everyone uneasy. Her name was Megan Holloway, and she was a former staff member of Governor Caldwell's office. Megan had already made headlines in the days leading up to the trial. With her insider knowledge of the inner workings of the governor's office, she had resigned from her position several months before the eviction, but she had crucial information that no one had expected. She took the witness stand, nervously adjusting her glasses. Judge Judy's stern gaze was unwavering as she addressed Megan. Miss Holloway, I trust you understand the gravity of your testimony today. You have information that may change the course of this trial. Do you wish to proceed? Megan nodded, her voice shaky but clear. Yes, Your Honor. I'm ready. Judge Judy's gaze softened slightly, but there was no mistaking her commanding presence. Good. Tell us everything you know. Start with the emails you uncovered. Megan hesitated for a moment, glancing at the attorneys seated in the front row. She looked at Denise Carter, who was seated at the plaintiff's table, her eyes filled with quiet determination. Then, with a deep breath, she began. It was just before the eviction was carried out. I was working in the office when I stumbled upon a string of emails. At first, they didn't make sense. But as I dug deeper, I realized they were discussing the upcoming redevelopment project. Specifically, Phase 1, the part that targeted low-income tenants. She paused for a moment, collecting her thoughts. The emails came from Governor Caldwell's personal account. There was one in particular where he was discussing the need to clear out tenants before a major press visit. He said it was necessary to present a clean slate for the media, make it look like the project was progressing without any hurdles. The courtroom was dead silent. The only sound was the faint scribbling of pens and the occasional rustle of papers. Megan's words had hit like a bombshell. The idea that the governor had knowingly planned to evict people, not for any real development purpose, but for optics, was more than the courtroom could handle. Judge Judy narrowed her eyes. "You're saying the governor, the one who testified just yesterday, intentionally cleared out tenants to make the project look good for a press visit?" Megan nodded, her voice trembling as she answered, "Yes, Your Honor. I saw the email with my own eyes. He was adamant that the building needed to be empty before the visit. There were no discussions about the tenants' rights or their living conditions. It was all about image, how it would look to the public." The crowd in the gallery seemed to hold its breath. Some were visibly shaken by the weight of Megan's testimony. Others were taking notes furiously, aware of the impact her words would have on the case. David Reynolds, the lead attorney for the plaintiffs, stood up to cross-examine Megan. "Miss Holloway, you've already made it clear that you found these emails while working in the governor's office. But let me ask you this. Did you report these emails to anyone at the time?" Megan looked down for a moment, then met David's gaze. "I didn't. I was new to the office, and I was afraid. I didn't know what to do. But when I saw what was happening to Miss Carter and the others, I couldn't stay silent any longer. That's when I decided to come forward." David nodded, his voice softening. "And you did the right thing. What's important now is that you've given us the truth. These emails are crucial evidence. They show that the governor's office was not only aware of the eviction, but orchestrated it for nothing more than political gain." Judge Judy's voice rang out sharply, cutting through the courtroom. "Miss Holloway, thank you for your honesty. Your testimony has added weight to this case, and it will not be overlooked." Turning to the defense attorney, Judge Judy's tone shifted to a cold, piercing edge. "I expect you to explain to this court how you intend to address these revelations. The people of California deserve answers, and if the governor cannot provide them, he will have to answer for his actions." The defense attorney, a sharp-looking man in his 40s, stood up nervously. "Your Honor, we are not disputing the existence of the emails, but we will argue that the governor had no intent to harm anyone. It was simply a misunderstanding. Judge Judy raised an eyebrow. A misunderstanding. The emails say otherwise. And what about the families who were affected by this so-called misunderstanding? What about Miss Carter? You can't hide behind a feeble excuse. David Reynolds didn't wait for the defense to continue. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. The governor's office planned and executed the eviction. And now, Miss Carter, along with all the other displaced tenants, deserve justice. They have been victims of a system that values image over people. The courtroom was silent as Judge Judy paused for a long moment. The weight of the truth hung heavily in the air. She looked back at Megan Holloway, her gaze thoughtful. Thank you, Miss Holloway. You've given this court the final piece of the puzzle. Then, turning to the defense, Judge Judy's voice cut through the room. We will reconvene tomorrow. Prepare yourselves. The truth has been laid bare, and there is no turning back. As Megan was excused from the stand, Denise Carter sat back in her seat, her heart pounding. Every word of Megan's testimony had pushed her one step closer to the justice she had been fighting for. She had known the governor was guilty, but hearing the truth spoken so openly in court gave her a sense of power she hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow, the tide would turn, and Governor Caldwell's actions would no longer remain hidden. Justice was on the horizon. The following day brought with it a renewed sense of anticipation in the courtroom. The previous day's testimony from Megan Holloway had left everyone in the gallery on edge. The truth about Governor Caldwell's role in the eviction was now undeniable, and the pressure was mounting. Judge Judy entered the courtroom, her presence commanding immediate attention. She walked with purpose to her bench, her eyes scanning the room. The courtroom was silent. Every person holding their breath, waiting for the next chapter of this unfolding drama. As the proceedings began, it was clear that the governor's defense team was scrambling to find a way out. Their argument, that the eviction was a mere misunderstanding, was becoming less and less credible by the second. The emails, the testimony, the evidence, all of it pointed to one undeniable conclusion. The governor had orchestrated the eviction for his own political gain. But what no one had expected was the sudden revelation that was about to surface. David Reynolds, the lead attorney for the plaintiffs, stood up to address the court. His voice was steady, but there was an edge of urgency in it. Your Honor, there is one more matter that needs to be brought to light. One more piece of evidence that could prove the governor's actions were not only premeditated, but were done with a specific intent to harm. The room buzzed with whispers. The defense attorney, visibly sweating, shot a nervous glance at his client. Governor Caldwell's face was hard to read, but his clenched jaw suggested he was preparing for the worst. Judge Judy leaned forward, her sharp eyes locking onto David as she gave him the floor. Go on, Mr. Reynolds. You've made your case, but I'm intrigued. What other bombshell do you have for us? David didn't hesitate. He turned to the large screen behind him, where a series of photos began to appear one by one. The images were stark and telling. At first, they appeared to be regular photos of the governor. But as the images flicked to the next, a new detail emerged. An image of Governor Caldwell, standing in a meeting room with several developers. The developers were laughing. But it wasn't their laughter that was so chilling. It was the stack of eviction notices, sitting on the table between them. The photos showed the developers pointing at different neighborhoods, including the one where Denise Carter and other tenants lived. The conversation in the room was clearly centered around clearing out these neighborhoods to make room for the new development project. The governor appeared to be in agreement, nodding and even smiling at certain points. There was no denying the implication. The images painted a picture of a coordinated plan. A plan where tenants like Denise were simply obstacles to the governor's financial interests. Judge Judy's expression hardened as she scanned the images. She raised her hand, signaling for the images to be paused. "Mr. Reynolds, are these photos as damning as they appear?" David nodded, his voice firm. "Yes, Your Honor." These photos show that the governor was not only aware of the eviction, but actively involved in planning it. The developers were at the heart of this operation, and the governor's participation was not accidental. This was no mistake. This was a calculated effort to push out the people who stood in the way of his political agenda. The courtroom erupted into a flurry of whispers. Some people gasped in disbelief, while others sat in stunned silence. Governor Caldwell's face had gone pale. His usual confident demeanor had completely vanished, replaced with an expression of fear and disbelief. Judge Judy turned her gaze toward the defense table. "Governor Caldwell, I'll give you the opportunity to explain these images." The governor's attorney, a woman in her early 50s, stood up quickly, her face flushed with panic. She cleared her throat before speaking. "Your Honor, these images do not tell the full story." The governor was simply attending a routine meeting with developers. These photos were taken out of context. Judge Judy cut her off immediately, her voice like ice. "Out of context? It appears to me that the only thing out of context is your argument. The governor is seen here discussing eviction notices, coordinating with developers, and discussing properties that were later evacuated under his orders. There is no context in which this looks acceptable." The defense attorney faltered, her words losing their weight as the truth set in. "And don't forget the testimony from Miss Holloway. She's already made it clear that the governor's office was actively trying to remove tenants to make room for his own plans. These images only confirm what we already know." The defense attorney looked down, knowing she had lost control of the narrative. Judge Judy turned back to David. "Mr. Reynolds, this evidence is devastating. What do you intend to do next?" David took a deep breath, his voice calm but filled with conviction. Your Honor, now that the governor's involvement has been exposed, we request an immediate injunction to prevent any further eviction attempts. We also request that the governor be held accountable for the actions taken under his authority. The tenants of this building, including Miss Carter, deserve justice. Judge Judy nodded solemnly. Your request is granted. We will move forward with this case, and I assure you, we will not rest until every wrong has been righted. Turning to the defense, Judge Judy's voice was firm and unyielding. Governor Caldwell, I suggest you prepare for what comes next. You are no longer in control of this situation. The truth has been revealed, and justice will follow. With that, Judge Judy called for a short recess, allowing the courtroom to process the magnitude of the revelations. The tension was palpable as the people in the gallery whispered among themselves. Governor Caldwell sat slumped in his chair, defeated. His once powerful position had been shattered by the very people he had tried to silence. For Denise Carter and the other tenants, this was a turning point. The road ahead was still long, but with every new piece of evidence, they were one step closer to reclaiming what had been taken from them. The governor's empire was beginning to crumble, and there was no turning back now. After the recess, the courtroom was filled with a tense energy as everyone took their seats. The images that had just been revealed had left a lasting impact. But it was far from over. Governor Caldwell's attorney, still rattled from the latest developments, was now preparing for the inevitable. Judge Judy returned to her seat, her demeanor as composed as ever. She looked down at the governor, whose face was now flushed with a mix of anger and disbelief. His position of power seemed fragile now, the foundation of his political career beginning to crack. The governor's attorney, visibly sweating, stood to her feet and addressed the court. Your Honor, we would like to move forward with the cross-examination of the plaintiff. We believe that, given the latest revelations, there may have been some confusion or misunderstanding on her part. Judge Judy raised an eyebrow, her gaze unwavering. Mr. Reynolds, do you have any objections to the cross-examination? David Reynolds shook his head, his voice calm yet filled with resolve. No objections, Your Honor. We welcome the opportunity for the defense to make their case. With that, the governor's attorney stepped forward, her eyes locked on Denise Carter. Denise sat with her back straight, her hands folded on the table in front of her, her face a mixture of determination and calm. She knew what was coming. She had braced herself for this moment, the moment where they would attempt to discredit her. The defense attorney cleared her throat and began. Miss Carter, do you claim that Governor Caldwell personally orchestrated the eviction of you and your neighbors, as the evidence suggests? Denise raised her head slightly, her voice unwavering. Yes, I do. The evidence speaks for itself. Governor Caldwell was involved in the eviction process, and his office pushed for our removal from the building, so they could make way for development projects. The attorney scoffed, trying to undermine Denise's confidence. Isn't it true that you were simply one of many tenants affected by the governor's office, and that no one person was singled out? Surely, this was just a routine decision that affects people across the city. Denise's eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward, her voice firm. No, it wasn't routine. This wasn't just a policy decision, this was personal. Governor Caldwell targeted us, and the evidence shows that he knew exactly what was going on. This wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate action to push people like me out. The defense attorney was momentarily silent, perhaps trying to formulate her next move. She quickly recovered and pressed on. But you didn't know Governor Caldwell personally, did you? You didn't have any direct dealings with him, correct? Denise met her eyes with unwavering strength. No, but I didn't need to know him personally to see the damage his decisions were causing. I saw the emails, the phone calls, the plans. I don't need to meet the man to know that he's responsible for what happened to my family. There was a long silence. The attorney seemed to realize that her line of questioning wasn't having the intended effect. Judge Judy, who had been listening carefully, finally spoke. Let's be clear here. The defense is trying to discredit Ms. Carter, but the facts are clear. The governor's involvement in this eviction goes beyond any routine policy decision. This was a planned, targeted action, and Ms. Carter has made that abundantly clear. The defense attorney shifted uneasily, but she continued her questioning. Miss Carter? Could it be that you misunderstood the governor's intentions? Perhaps his actions were not as malicious as you claim. Could you have been mistaken? Denise's eyes glinted with a quiet fire as she shook her head. I wasn't mistaken. The emails prove it. The testimony proves it. You can't rewrite what happened. Judge Judy nodded in agreement. This is no misunderstanding. The evidence speaks for itself. You've had your chance to question the plaintiff, and it's clear that Ms. Carter is telling the truth. The defense attorney's face darkened, but she knew she had lost control. She turned away from Denise and back to Judge Judy. Your Honor, we rest our case. There was a brief moment of silence, and then the tension in the room thickened as Judge Judy leaned forward, her eyes locked on the governor. Governor Caldwell, you've been given every opportunity to explain yourself, and so far, you have failed to provide any adequate defense. You are being accused of using your power to push people out of their homes for the sake of political gain. This is no small matter. The governor, who had been quiet until now, opened his mouth to speak, but Judge Judy raised her hand, silencing him immediately. I suggest you hold off on your explanation, Governor. At this point, the evidence is against you. There will be no more chances for excuses. The room fell into a heavy silence. The weight of the moment was impossible to ignore. Everyone could feel it. The certainty that the governor's fate was sealed. Judge Judy continued, her voice unwavering. You will have the opportunity to address the court again. But know this, the court has seen enough. The people you've hurt will get the justice they deserve. Governor Caldwell sat back, his face a mask of resignation. He was no longer the powerful figure who had walked into the courtroom days earlier. His influence, once unshakable, was crumbling before his eyes. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the proceedings entered their final stages. Governor Caldwell's political empire had been shaken to its core, and the plaintiffs, led by Denise Carter, had presented a compelling case. All that remained were the closing arguments, where each side would have their final opportunity to sway the court's opinion. Judge Judy, her face as stoic as ever, sat back in her chair, watching the attorneys with a careful eye. The room was filled with anticipation, the weight of the case bearing down on everyone present. It had been a long trial, but now it seemed like the end was near. David Reynolds, the lead attorney for the plaintiffs, stood up first. He adjusted his suit jacket and walked toward the center of the courtroom, his steps firm and confident. His face was a picture of determination. He had seen the evidence, heard the testimony, and knew that the truth was on his side. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm but full of conviction. "What we've seen in this trial is a pattern of behavior that cannot be ignored. Governor Caldwell, using his office and influence, targeted vulnerable tenants like Denise Carter. He pushed them out of their homes for the sake of development projects that would enrich him and his allies." Reynolds paused, letting his words sink in. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on him. This was no mistake. This was no misunderstanding. The emails, the testimony, the photos, all of it paints a clear picture. Governor Caldwell did not act in the best interests of the people. He used his power for personal gain, and in doing so, he ruined lives. The governor's actions were not only a violation of Denise's rights, but they were an affront to the very principles of justice. When the powerful can use their influence to trample on the rights of the most vulnerable, that is when society fails. Reynolds's voice grew stronger, more passionate, as he continued. The tenants of this building, including Denise, deserve justice. They deserve the opportunity to stay in their homes, to live without fear of being displaced for the sake of someone else's profit. We are asking for the court to hold Governor Caldwell accountable for his actions, to send a message that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. He took a deep breath, his expression resolute. Governor Caldwell must answer for what he's done, and it is our hope that, in doing so, we can ensure that no one else is ever subjected to the same fate. With that, Reynolds stepped back, his closing arguments complete. The courtroom was filled with an eerie silence as he returned to his seat. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. Judge Judy took a long moment to absorb everything she had just heard. She turned to the defense, her gaze unwavering. Governor Caldwell's attorney, who had been sitting with a tense look on her face, stood up reluctantly. She had been hoping for a different outcome, but now, with the closing arguments underway, she knew her position was slipping away. "Your Honor," she began, her voice shaky but determined. "We acknowledge the evidence presented, but we must reiterate that there was no intent to harm. The eviction of the tenants was done under the auspices of a broader plan to improve the city, to provide affordable housing and better resources for everyone." The defense attorney paused, looking toward the governor, who was sitting with his head bowed. She continued, her words less confident now. "Governor Caldwell never intended for anyone to suffer. Yes, the eviction happened, but it was part of a larger process that, in the end, will benefit the community. The governor, despite what the plaintiffs might suggest, did not act with malice. He acted with the best intentions for the greater good." But the governor's attorney's words seemed to falter as she spoke. The room, which had once been filled with a sense of uncertainty, now felt heavy with the undeniable truth that had been exposed during the trial. Judge Judy, who had been listening carefully, did not allow the defense attorney to continue. "Enough," she said, her voice firm. "I've heard enough." The defense attorney, clearly rattled, looked down at the floor. There was nothing more she could say. The truth was already out in the open. Judge Judy turned to face the courtroom. The weight of the case was not lost on her. This wasn't just about one eviction. This was about the abuse of power, the corruption of those who were supposed to serve and protect the people, and the consequences of allowing such actions to go unchecked. She spoke slowly, each word carrying the full weight of her authority. "We have heard the evidence, and we have heard the arguments. It is clear that Governor Caldwell used his position for personal gain, that he deliberately evicted tenants, including Ms. Carter, to further his own interests. This is not just a failure of leadership, this is a betrayal of the people he was elected to serve." Judge Judy paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiffs. Governor Caldwell is hereby ordered to pay restitution to the tenants affected by his actions, and his involvement in this eviction scheme will be thoroughly investigated. This case is far from over, and Governor Caldwell will be held accountable for every decision that led to this injustice." The room erupted in murmurs. It was official. Governor Caldwell had been found guilty. As Denise Carter's eyes filled with tears of relief, she knew that the fight wasn't over. But this was a victory she would remember for the rest of her life. She had stood up to a man with immense power, and now the truth had triumphed. Judge Judy's gavel came down with a sharp crack, signaling the end of the trial. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the ruling settled over everyone. Governor Caldwell, now officially found guilty of the illegal eviction scheme, remained seated, his hands trembling ever so slightly. His face, once full of confidence and arrogance, had now transformed into a grim mask of defeat. The reality of his fall from power was sinking in. For Denise Carter and the other tenants, however, the ruling felt like a hard-earned victory. As the courtroom slowly emptied, a sense of justice lingered in the air. People exchanged glances, nodding in quiet approval. They had witnessed something monumental. A man who thought he could wield power without consequence had been brought to justice. But this victory, as sweet as it was not the end of the story. David Reynolds, Denise's attorney, stood up and approached her. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his voice low but full of pride. "You did it, Denise. This is a huge win." Denise, her face still flushed with emotion, nodded, her eyes never leaving the front of the courtroom. The victory was hers, but it had come at a cost. Her life, her family's life, and the lives of the other tenants had been turned upside down. Yet, in this moment, she could finally breathe. "Thank you, David," she said softly. "I couldn't have done it without you." David smiled and stepped back, watching as Denise stood tall, her posture straight and proud. The courtroom doors opened, and one by one, people began to leave. Among them was a reporter who had been covering the trial for the local news. She approached Denise, her camera crew in tow. "Miss Carter, can I ask you for a quick statement?" Denise turned toward the reporter, her face calm but resolute. "Today, justice was served," she began. "Governor Caldwell used his power to hurt people, but we stood up. We fought, and we won. This victory isn't just mine. It's for every person who has ever been pushed aside because someone in power thought they could get away with it." The reporter smiled, impressed by Denise's strength. She quickly scribbled notes, eager to capture the full essence of what Denise had said. Behind her, the governor was still sitting in his chair, his lawyer by his side. His posture was slumped. His once pristine suit now seeming to hang on him like a symbol of his disgrace. He looked like a man who had just lost everything. David Reynolds glanced over his shoulder, noticing the governor's defeated figure. His thoughts were interrupted by Denise, who turned to him with a determined look. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice steady. David paused, thinking carefully about his response. "Well, the court ruling is just the beginning. There will be an investigation into the governor's actions. We will file for restitution for all the tenants affected, and hopefully that will help you and your neighbors get back on your feet. As for Governor Caldwell, this ruling will follow him. His career is over." Denise looked up at David, her expression softening for a moment. "I didn't do this for the fame or the money. I did it for my kids, for my family. I want to make sure that what happened to us doesn't happen to anyone else." David nodded in agreement. "And you've done that. You've set an example. Your courage has shown others that even when the odds are stacked against you, you can make a difference." Denise's eyes glistened with tears as she looked toward the exit. "It's not just about me anymore. It's about making sure that no one else ever has to go through what we went through." As they exited the courtroom, Denise took one last look around. This place, which had once seemed so intimidating, now felt like a symbol of victory. She had faced one of the most powerful men in the state and won. But there was still work to be done. The fight for justice didn't end here. It had only just begun. News of the courtroom victory spread quickly, making headlines across the nation. It wasn't every day that a sitting governor was brought down by a lawsuit, especially one involving something as personal and heart-wrenching as the eviction of innocent families. As cameras flashed and reporters clamored outside the courthouse, Denise Carter found herself at the center of a media storm. She had expected some attention, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. News anchors and reporters lined up to get a word with her, and suddenly, Denise became a symbol of justice. Her phone rang constantly with offers from talk shows, news outlets, and advocacy groups eager to interview her. Denise, however, wasn't interested in the spotlight. Her mission had never been about fame or recognition. She simply wanted to make sure that her fight had meaning, that it would spark change for others in similar situations. David Reynolds, her attorney, stood beside her as the reporters swarmed around, asking questions and pushing microphones in her direction. He could see the unease on her face and gently nudged her to a quieter corner of the courthouse steps. "Take a deep breath, Denise," David said softly. "You've earned this moment, but don't let it distract you from what matters." Denise nodded, her hands clutching the papers she had carried throughout the trial. She was tired, physically, emotionally, and mentally drained. But she knew this moment was crucial. As she faced the camera crews, she took another breath, this time steadier. "I didn't do this for the attention," Denise began, her voice steady despite the storm of cameras around her. "I did it because what happened to me and my neighbors was wrong. We were just people trying to live our lives, and we were treated like we didn't matter. But now, we've shown that when we stand together, we can make a difference." Her words were simple, yet powerful. The reporters hung on every one, the cameras capturing the sincerity in her expression. Meanwhile, Governor Caldwell, his political reputation in ruins, was nowhere to be found. His once flourishing career had come to an abrupt halt. The media had already begun to dig deeper into his past, looking for any other signs of corruption or scandal that might explain how he had managed to hold such power for so long. Back in the courtroom, Judge Judy's gavel had not only symbolized the end of the case, but also marked the beginning of a larger, ongoing battle. Denise's victory had opened the door for other tenants and victims of powerful figures to come forward. The news outlets soon shifted their focus to the implications of the case. The governor's office had already issued a brief, public statement denying any wrongdoing, but the damage had been done. The press was relentless, and the pressure on Governor Caldwell only grew. There was also speculation about whether Governor Caldwell would face criminal charges, or if the investigation would extend beyond the eviction scandal. For now, however, the focus remained on Denise Carter and the powerful statement she had made. As the days passed, more tenants from Caldwell's properties began to come forward with their own stories of unfair treatment and unlawful evictions. Denise had sparked a movement, a chain reaction that could not be stopped. The wheels of justice were in motion, and no one, not even the governor, could escape them. Despite the media frenzy, Denise kept a low profile. She didn't want to be seen as a hero. She was just a woman who had done what she believed was right. But as she sat at home that evening, looking at the evening news on television, she couldn't help but smile. The story had become bigger than she had ever dreamed, and the fight for justice was now out of her hands. Her children, who had been through so much during the eviction process, sat with her, their faces now filled with a quiet pride. They had seen their mother fight, and they knew they had witnessed something monumental. "I'm proud of you, Mom," her son said, his voice filled with admiration. Denise smiled, brushing a tear away from her cheek. "I'm proud of you too, sweetheart. We did this together." She looked at her family, knowing that this wasn't just her victory. It was theirs as well. The battle had been long, but they had made it through. And as for Governor Caldwell, his downfall was inevitable. The story of his corruption would be told for years to come, and his name would forever be linked to one of the most dramatic court cases in recent history. The victory had been won, but the fight for justice was far from over. In the weeks following the court case, the public's reaction to Denise Carter's victory was nothing short of overwhelming. People from all walks of life reached out to her, offering congratulations, expressing gratitude, and, in some cases, sharing their own stories of injustice. The case had ignited a fire in the hearts of many who had felt powerless for far too long. For some, Denise had become a beacon of hope, a reminder that standing up against powerful forces was not only possible but necessary. The media continued to cover the case, running special reports on the eviction crisis and the ways in which politicians had been using their power to exploit the vulnerable. The coverage reached across the nation, sparking debates on the fairness of housing laws, tenants' rights, and government accountability. It wasn't just the local news stations that were talking about Denise's victory. National outlets, including major networks and newspapers, were publishing articles about the ruling. The governor's office had tried to spin the story in his favor, claiming the eviction was part of a larger economic strategy. But the public wasn't buying it. The people saw through the lies. The social media landscape exploded with support for Denise. Hashtags like theft, justice for Denise, and I stand with the tenants trended across platforms. Celebrities and activists weighed in, sharing their thoughts on the case and calling for further investigations into corruption in local governments. Denise's name was becoming synonymous with social justice, and her actions were being celebrated as a win for the everyday person. But with the increased attention came the inevitable backlash. Supporters of Governor Caldwell tried to argue that the case had been blown out of proportion, claiming that Denise and her lawyer had played on emotions to gain public sympathy. They pointed to the courtroom drama as if it were mere theatre, not realizing the lasting impact the case would have on so many lives. But their efforts were largely in vain. The weight of the evidence and the sheer volume of public support for Denise kept the governor's defenders on the defensive. For Denise, however, the media attention was both a blessing and a curse. While she was happy that her story was raising awareness and inspiring others to fight back against injustice, she had never set out to be in the limelight. She just wanted to get her life back on track, to ensure that her family could live without fear of being wrongfully evicted again. The phone calls continued, and so did the interviews. Denise found herself speaking with organizations that were working to end wrongful evictions and corruption in government. She spoke at rallies and events, telling her story and encouraging others to join the fight. She was no longer just a victim. She had become an advocate for change. Through it all, Denise remained grounded. She didn't let the fame go to her head. Her focus was always on her family, on ensuring that no one else would have to face what she had gone through. But even as she continued to speak out and use her platform for good, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still unfinished business. She had won the battle, but the war for justice was far from over. There were still so many other tenants like her who had been wronged and whose stories had yet to be told. And then there was Governor Caldwell. His political career, once thought to be untouchable, was now in tatters. Despite his best efforts to shift blame, it was clear that the public had lost faith in him. He had made a critical mistake in thinking that his position would protect him from accountability. But as his support dwindled, his options became fewer and fewer. The pressure on him continued to build, with investigations into his other activities intensifying. The public demanded answers, and the media had no intention of letting the story die. It was only a matter of time before Caldwell would have to face even more serious charges. Denise knew that her victory, while monumental, was only one chapter in a much larger story. The case had exposed deep flaws in the system, and as more people came forward with their own experiences, it was clear that the fight for justice was far from over. Denise's resolve was unwavering. She had started this journey not for fame or recognition, but for the simple goal of securing justice. And now that she had seen what was possible when the system worked, there was no turning back. She would continue to fight for herself, for her family, and for everyone who had been pushed to the margins. Governor Caldwell may have lost his power, but Denise Carter had gained something far more valuable, a voice, and with it, the power to make a difference. As the months passed, the dust slowly settled. The case that had shaken the political world, that had inspired thousands to stand up for their rights, and that had put a spotlight on the systemic flaws in housing and government policy, became a cornerstone of the fight for justice in America. Denise Carter, the woman at the center of it all, was not just remembered as the victim of an unjust eviction. She had become a symbol of resilience, empowerment, and change. Her story had sparked conversations in boardrooms, courtrooms, and living rooms across the country. It had encouraged tenants to speak up. It had forced lawmakers to reconsider eviction laws. And it had inspired countless advocates to launch initiatives aimed at protecting vulnerable populations. What Denise had done was not just a personal victory. It had created a ripple effect, one that would continue to inspire action for years to come. Denise's life, however, had not returned to normal. Though the media frenzy had died down, the impact of the case lingered. She continued to receive messages of thanks and encouragement from people she had never met. Some reached out with their own stories, hoping to find solace in her experience. Others simply wanted to say that they, too, were fighting for justice in their own ways. The case had also opened new doors for Denise. She was invited to speak at conferences and was approached by organizations that sought her support. She had become an unexpected voice for social justice, a voice that wasn't afraid to stand up against powerful figures. But even as she embraced this new role, Denise remained humble. She had never set out to be a public figure or an advocate for change. She had only wanted to protect her family. And yet, here she was, standing at the forefront of a movement. Her children, who had been by her side through the entire ordeal, were growing up to understand the significance of their mother's actions. They were learning valuable lessons about standing up for what is right, even in the face of adversity. They were proud of her, and as they watched the world change around them, they knew that they had witnessed something extraordinary. In the halls of government, change was also beginning to take root. The governor's office had been forced to revise its policies on evictions, and other officials were facing scrutiny for their roles in the scandal. The case had made it clear that no one was above the law, no matter their position of power. The ripple effect was undeniable. Governor Caldwell's downfall had been swift and unforgiving. The scandal that followed the case forced him to resign in disgrace. But that was only the beginning of his troubles. Investigations into his other actions were underway, and his reputation had been forever tarnished. Caldwell, once a towering figure in California politics, now found himself the subject of ridicule and contempt. For Denise, however, the victory was bittersweet. While she was glad that justice had been served, she knew that there was still much work to be done. Her story had been the catalyst, but there were still so many others who had been wronged by the system. People like her, whose voices had been silenced for too long, needed a champion. And Denise was determined to be that champion. She worked tirelessly with various advocacy groups, using her newfound platform to push for more comprehensive reforms in housing laws. She spoke to lawmakers, pushing for stronger protections for tenants. And she collaborated with legal teams to provide assistance to others who were facing wrongful eviction. She knew that the work would be ongoing, but she was committed to seeing it through. The legacy of her victory stretched far beyond her own family. It was a victory for every person who had ever felt powerless in the face of an unjust system. It was a victory for those who had been denied their basic rights simply because of who they were or where they lived. And in the end, that was what mattered most to Denise. It wasn't the headlines, the interviews, or the awards. It was knowing that she had made a difference. That, more than anything, was the true measure of her success. As she sat with her family one evening, watching the sunset from their new home, Denise reflected on how far they had come. It had been a long road, filled with pain and uncertainty, but they had made it through. They had faced an unimaginable challenge, and they had emerged victorious. She glanced over at her children, who were laughing and playing together, and felt a sense of peace wash over her. No matter what came next, she knew that they would be okay. They had faced the storm together, and now they could finally begin to rebuild. Denise had started this journey as a woman who had been wronged, but she had ended it as a hero, not just for her family, but for the countless others who had found their voice through her. Denise Carter's story was far from over. Though her legal battle with Governor Caldwell had concluded, the impact of the case continued to resonate throughout California and beyond. It wasn't just about the eviction anymore. It was about what came after the victory, the steps taken to ensure that such injustices would not be repeated. The real fight for justice was just beginning, and Denise had made it clear that she wasn't going to stop until lasting change had been achieved. She spent months traveling the country, speaking at rallies, attending conferences, and meeting with lawmakers who were eager to learn from her experience. The media had largely moved on, but Denise's mission had only grown stronger. She knew that the work wasn't finished. Too many people, like her, had suffered silently, and they needed someone to stand up for them. She became a tireless advocate for housing reform, urging lawmakers to push for better protections for tenants and more transparency in government housing policies. In meetings with activists and community leaders, Denise shared her story again and again. She spoke not only about the pain she had endured, but also about the lessons she had learned. She talked about the importance of standing up to power, the necessity of fighting for what is right, and the undeniable truth that change could be achieved, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Her involvement in the fight for justice grew deeper as she partnered with other organizations focused on addressing racial discrimination in housing, education, and employment. The scars from her experience with Caldwell had not healed overnight, but they had fueled her passion for ensuring that no one else would have to endure such a violation of their rights. Denise knew that in order to make the systemic changes needed, she had to be in it for the long haul. Governor Caldwell, meanwhile, faced the consequences of his actions. His reputation, once considered untouchable, had been irreparably damaged. Public pressure mounted, and as investigations continued, it became clear that Caldwell had been involved in far more than just Denise's eviction. His connections to real estate developers with shady practices, his history of pushing policies that benefited the wealthy at the expense of the poor. It all began to unravel. The truth was coming to light, and there was no escaping the fallout. Denise's case had opened a Pandora's box of corruption, and the public wasn't going to let it go. Caldwell had no choice but to resign from his position as governor, but the damage was already done. His political career was over, and his future was uncertain. Investigations into his dealings with developers were just beginning, and there were whispers of criminal charges. For Denise, the sense of justice was not yet complete. She understood that one victory, no matter how significant, wasn't enough to overhaul an entire system that had allowed powerful figures to abuse their authority for years. While she took pride in the progress made, she knew that there was still so much work to do. As the years went on, Denise's influence only grew. She continued to speak out against the injustices that people like her had faced for decades. Her voice became a cornerstone in the fight for fair housing policies, and her story was cited in countless legal briefs and arguments. She was invited to testify before Congress, where she shared her experience and pushed for national changes in housing laws. But despite all her achievements, Denise never lost sight of the most important thing, her family. She remained dedicated to her children, ensuring they grew up knowing the power of perseverance, integrity, and empathy. She wanted them to understand that no matter how hard life got, no matter the challenges they faced, they could always find the strength to rise above. And though she had become a recognized figure in the fight for social justice, Denise never allowed herself to become a symbol. She remained a woman who had fought for her family, her community, and her rights. She refused to let the fame overshadow the cause, keeping her focus on the work that still needed to be done. In the end, Denise Carter had done more than just win a case against a powerful political figure. She had inspired a movement, ignited a conversation, and given a voice to those who had been silenced for far too long. Her victory wasn't just hers. It was a victory for everyone who had ever faced discrimination, for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. The fight for justice was a long one, but with people like Denise leading the charge, there was no doubt that it was a fight that would continue to gain momentum, one victory at a time. In the wake of Denise Carter's victory, the political landscape of California began to shift. What had once been a state where power was consolidated among a few wealthy elites who controlled both the political and real estate sectors was now facing unprecedented scrutiny. The court case that had brought Denise's eviction to the forefront had not just been about her home. It had been about a broken system, one that allowed landlords, developers, and even governors to push aside vulnerable families without consequence. Governor Caldwell's resignation was only the tip of the iceberg. The aftermath of the scandal sent shockwaves through California's political establishment. Investigations into corrupt practices began to sprout like weeds, and the public was demanding transparency. The spotlight on housing and eviction laws had intensified, and the call for accountability had never been louder. Denise Carter's name became synonymous with the fight for change. Across the state, people who had previously felt powerless now had a rallying cry. They saw her as someone who had taken on the system and won, and they began to organize, to petition, and to demand reform. It wasn't just about one individual's rights anymore. It was about a collective push for justice, equality, and fairness in housing. The governor's downfall had opened the doors for others to challenge the status quo. While Governor Caldwell was out of office, many of his allies in the political world felt the heat as well. Some of them resigned, while others faced public disgrace. The pressure from the public forced lawmakers to examine their policies and, in some cases, reverse laws that had been passed to benefit the wealthy and corporations. Public outcry led to new legislative proposals that sought to protect tenants from unjust evictions, prevent landlords from raising rents exorbitantly, and ensure that housing policies were designed to serve the people, not just the elites. Denise didn't sit idly by as the changes began to unfold. She knew that this moment could not be wasted. She had become a symbol of courage, and she was determined to make sure that her victory led to something even bigger than her own case. She continued to meet with lawmakers, guiding them through the necessary reforms, ensuring that the voices of the people who had been silenced for so long would finally be heard. One of the most significant changes that came from this period was the establishment of a new public housing oversight committee, which worked alongside state officials to make sure that eviction practices were fair and transparent. The committee's role was to investigate claims of unlawful evictions, review cases where tenants had been wrongfully evicted, and hold both landlords and political figures accountable. The transparency brought about by the new committee ensured that no one, no matter their status, could take advantage of vulnerable tenants. But it wasn't just about legal changes. Denise's influence extended to the community level as well. She worked with local organizations to create workshops that educated tenants about their rights, helping them understand the legal protections they had when facing eviction. These workshops also provided resources to tenants who were at risk of being unjustly removed from their homes, ensuring they knew who to turn to for help. Denise also focused on raising awareness about the long-term effects of eviction on families. She began to work with researchers to compile data showing the devastating impact evictions had on children, on health, and on communities as a whole. She used this data to advocate for policies that would prevent families from being displaced, recognizing that keeping families together in stable housing was essential for their well-being. As the months passed, the reform movement gained traction, and more voices joined the cause. Advocacy groups from across the state united, and the issue of housing injustice became a top priority for many lawmakers. The movement that had been sparked by Denise Carter's story was now a full-fledged campaign for change, one that was transforming the way California thought about housing, power, and justice. But Denise's personal journey didn't stop with the movement. Despite her growing influence, she remained focused on her family and her own healing. The emotional scars from the eviction and the subsequent fight for justice took time to heal. There were days when Denise felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had started. But she found strength in the love of her children and the support of her community. Denise's children, who had witnessed their mother's transformation from a single mother struggling to protect her family into a national advocate for justice, were growing up to be young adults who understood the importance of standing up for what is right. They had seen the power of resilience, the importance of community, and the undeniable truth that change was possible. As a family, they spent their evenings together, reflecting on the events that had changed their lives. Denise often spoke to them about the lessons she had learned: the importance of speaking up, of using your voice to demand change, and of never backing down, no matter how powerful the opposition may seem. Denise Carter's story was no longer just about one woman's fight for justice. It had become a defining moment in California's history, a turning point that had ignited a movement for fairness, equality, and the protection of tenant rights. And as the years went by, Denise knew that the fight was far from over. But with each step forward, with each new law passed, with each person who found the courage to stand up for themselves, she knew they were getting closer to the justice they all deserved. Months after the courtroom drama had subsided, Denise Carter sat quietly in her living room, reflecting on how much her life had changed. What had started as a personal fight to regain her home had grown into a statewide movement. The pressure she had placed on the government and on lawmakers had finally paid off. But the battle for fair housing was far from over. There was still so much more to be done. California, once known for its lack of affordable housing, had now become a battleground for tenants' rights. The newfound attention on the issue had sparked intense public discourse. Politicians, once reluctant to even discuss tenant protection laws, were now being forced to take action. It was a victory, but Denise knew it was just the beginning. After the fallout from Governor Caldwell's eviction of Denise, other states started to take notice. Across the country, there were rumblings of similar corruption within local housing policies. There was a national outcry, and people were demanding changes. What happened to Denise could have easily happened to anyone else. She had become the face of a movement that was now spreading beyond California's borders. Her story of resilience and perseverance had touched hearts far and wide. In California, the ripple effects of her fight led to a cascade of reforms. Tenants' rights were given more weight in the political arena, and lawmakers who had previously ignored the needs of marginalized communities now had no choice but to act. Rent control laws were strengthened, and illegal evictions became a punishable offense, with harsher penalties for landlords who attempted to circumvent the system. The most significant change, however, came in the form of a statewide initiative that established an independent housing oversight board. This board was designed to serve as a watchdog over evictions, ensuring that landlords and developers could no longer exploit their power over vulnerable tenants. For the first time in California history, tenants had a powerful advocate within the state government. Denise worked closely with this board, helping shape policies that would guarantee housing stability for everyone, not just the privileged few. She was instrumental in creating new legislation that would make it nearly impossible for landlords to evict tenants without going through a strict and transparent process. No longer could a governor or powerful businessman force families from their homes on a whim. The changes had a profound effect on the state's most vulnerable populations. For many low-income families, the fear of eviction that once loomed over them had been replaced with a sense of security. Families could now breathe easier, knowing that the law was on their side. The work that Denise had started had made California a place where tenants could stand up for their rights and feel protected by the system. But not everyone was happy with the new policies. The real estate industry, which had flourished for years under the previous system, was facing a crisis. Developers who had previously profited from the displacement of low-income tenants were now being forced to change their business practices. Some tried to push back against the new laws, but their attempts were futile. The movement had grown too powerful, and the public was no longer willing to tolerate such exploitation. The governor's office had changed hands, but the impact of Caldwell's downfall had left an indelible mark on the political culture of the state. No longer could a politician escape scrutiny for their actions. The new governor, Sarah Brooks, had pledged to continue the reforms, started by Denise's case, and the state legislature worked closely with tenant advocacy groups to ensure that those protections would not only remain in place, but be strengthened further. Denise's victory had also sparked a cultural shift. People who had once been afraid to speak out against their landlords or the government now felt empowered to demand change. Communities came together to support one another in ways they hadn't before. The movement she had led created a collective strength that could not be ignored. Denise knew that the true power of this change lay not in the laws themselves, but in the people who had learned to advocate for their rights. While California was no longer the place of unchecked exploitation it once had been, Denise knew that the fight for justice was an ongoing one. The case against Governor Caldwell may have been the catalyst, but it was the collective action of thousands of Californians that had truly brought about change. Denise often thought back to the days when she was just a mother fighting for her home, unaware of how her actions would change the course of history. She had never sought fame or recognition. She simply wanted to protect her family. But the lessons she had learned along the way, the strength she had gained, and the people she had met, these had become the true rewards of her struggle. As Denise sat on the couch, watching her children play in the yard, she realized that she had done more than just win a case. She had changed the lives of countless others. Her children, now older, understood the value of standing up for what was right. They had witnessed the transformation of their mother, and they, too, were beginning to recognize the power of their own voices. Denise smiled, knowing that no matter how far her fight had taken her, she would always remain rooted in the community that had helped her get here. Her story had sparked a revolution in housing, but it had also started a movement of hope, resilience, and the belief that, together, people could create lasting change. As the years passed, Denise Carter's name became more than just a symbol of resistance. It became a legacy. The reforms that had been implemented in California, due to her tireless fight against her wrongful eviction, began to have ripple effects across the nation. Other states, inspired by California's model, started to introduce similar protections for tenants, setting a new standard for housing laws in the United States. Denise, however, did not rest on her laurels. She continued to be an active voice for tenant rights, even as her influence grew. She had become not just a local figure, but a national one, and her story was often cited in discussions about social justice and housing reforms. In conferences, town halls, and even international forums, Denise was invited to speak about her experience, about the impact of the reforms she had inspired, and about what still needed to be done. Her fight had never been about her personal gain. It had always been about making a difference. And now, more than ever, Denise was driven to see the changes she had sparked reach their full potential. She wasn't just advocating for policies, she was fighting for a cultural shift in how the nation viewed housing as a basic human right. The truth was, the damage caused by years of unfair evictions and skyrocketing rents could not be undone overnight. There were still millions of people across the country who faced the very real possibility of being forced from their homes due to corporate greed, corrupt politics, and systemic inequality. But Denise's voice had helped to shift the narrative. Housing was no longer a commodity. It was a right that needed to be protected. The power of collective action was on full display. The advocacy organizations that Denise had worked with during the fight to reform California's eviction laws had become powerful forces in their own right. They were now collaborating with other grassroots organizations across the country, building coalitions to push for similar reforms. In places like New York, Texas, and even Florida, it was no longer about one person's story. It was about thousands of stories coming together to demand justice. One of the most powerful moments came when a group of California residents who had been directly impacted by the changes in the law formed a coalition called the Evicted No More. This group, which included people from all walks of life, single mothers, working-class families, immigrants, and senior citizens, gathered to share their stories and to advocate for others still at risk of eviction. Their message was simple but profound. No one should ever be forced from their home without just cause. The group's work was instrumental in pushing for further protections and safeguards against eviction. They worked closely with local government officials, leveraging the momentum from Denise's success to implement laws that would make it even harder for tenants to be evicted without due process. This included mandating that all landlords undergo training in tenant rights, creating a database of abusive landlords, and instituting a rent control law that ensured tenants would not face exorbitant increases in their rent. The new legal framework also placed more power in the hands of tenants. Courts had been restructured to make eviction cases more transparent and accessible to the public. The burden of proof now fell on the landlords to demonstrate that eviction was justified, and tenants had the right to challenge the eviction in court if they believed it was unfair. As the movement grew, Denise saw more and more faces in the crowd. People who were no longer afraid to speak up, to demand what was rightfully theirs. The stigma around eviction had slowly faded. Once a taboo subject, people now discussed it openly, sharing their experiences and showing others that they were not alone. Social media played a pivotal role in this change, with individuals sharing their eviction stories and receiving support from others who had been through similar struggles. The digital age allowed Denise's work to reach even more people, and she embraced it wholeheartedly. Through these efforts, Denise also began to collaborate with policymakers on the national level. Her testimony before Congress, where she shared the story of her eviction and its profound impact on her family, led to the creation of a federal Housing Reform Bill. This bill called for stricter regulations on evictions, rent controls, and greater oversight of landlord practices. It was a historic piece of legislation that many attributed to Denise's advocacy, and it was clear that her influence would be felt for generations to come. Denise knew, however, that the fight was far from over. She had seen firsthand how quickly power could shift, how easily laws could be rewritten, and how vulnerable people could still be at the mercy of corrupt practices. But she was no longer the woman she had once been. The one who had started her fight as an individual, desperate to protect her family. She had grown into something much larger than herself. She had become a voice for the voiceless, a defender of those who had been silenced for too long. Her family had become an integral part of the movement as well. Her children, now young adults, had become advocates in their own right. Continuing their mother's work, they organized rallies, spoke at local meetings, and worked alongside Denise to ensure that their community remained protected. What had once been a single mother's fight had now become a family legacy, and Denise knew that her children would carry it forward, long after she was gone. As Denise looked back at everything that had happened, she could not help but feel a sense of pride. She had won more than just her home. She had won a future for countless families across the country. She had stood up, and in doing so, had ignited a movement. She had shown that no matter how impossible the odds seemed, it was always worth fighting for what was right. In the years following the reforms in California, Denise Carter found herself increasingly in the national spotlight. Her story, which had begun as a personal fight for justice, had become a beacon of hope for millions of people across the country. No longer just the woman who had stood up to a governor and won. Denise had transformed into a powerful advocate for tenant rights and social justice. Media outlets were constantly reaching out for interviews. News anchors, journalists, and even documentary filmmakers sought to tell her story, to understand how a single mother's determination had led to a nationwide movement. Denise was featured in countless articles, her face becoming synonymous with the fight for housing equality. She was invited to appear on national talk shows, where she spoke passionately about the ongoing struggles facing renters in cities across the United States. Though she appreciated the recognition, Denise was careful not to let the attention cloud her mission. She was focused on the work that still needed to be done. The new laws in California had sparked a shift in how people viewed housing, but there was so much more to address. The national spotlight on her made it easier to amplify her message, but it also brought a new set of challenges. The pressure was higher, the expectations greater, and the stakes even larger. Despite the growing spotlight, Denise never let it distract her from the people who needed help. She knew that her journey had been a long one, and while she had achieved many victories, There were still too many people across the country suffering from unfair evictions, unaffordable rents, and exploitative landlords. She remained grounded, always remembering the struggle that had brought her here. She often said that if she could help just one more person, then all her work would be worth it. Her efforts soon led to partnerships with several other high-profile organizations dedicated to social justice. Denise became a regular speaker at rallies and conferences hosted by tenant rights groups, where she would meet with lawmakers, activists, and experts in the field. She worked tirelessly to ensure that the conversation about housing inequality continued, constantly advocating for those who had been left behind by the system. One of the most significant developments during this time was the launch of a nationwide coalition of tenant advocacy organizations. These groups, inspired by Denise's efforts, had come together to create a unified voice for renters across the country. The coalition's goal was to push for sweeping changes at the federal level, ensuring that tenants had protections not just in California, but throughout the United States. Denise's role in this coalition was pivotal. She provided the leadership and direction needed to keep the movement organized and focused. She helped shape policies, authored petitions, and lobbied lawmakers to push for national housing reforms. As the coalition grew, so did its influence. It was clear that Denise's success in California had not just been a local win. It had set the stage for national change. But there were still those who opposed the reforms. Developers, large landlords, and some members of Congress were pushing back against the growing influence of tenant advocacy groups. They argued that the new laws would hurt business and lead to job losses in the housing and construction sectors. Their arguments, however, were based on protecting profit margins rather than the needs of the people. Denise had heard these arguments before, but this time she was more prepared to fight back. She knew that the fight for tenants' rights wasn't just about the people who had been wronged in the past. It was about creating a better future for all renters everywhere. She would not back down. Every time an opponent made their case, Denise countered with the stories of real people. The families, the mothers, the children, and the workers who had lost everything because of a system that allowed landlords to operate unchecked. One of the major victories of this time was the passage of a new federal law aimed at capping rent increases for all renters across the United States. This law was groundbreaking. It ensured that no tenant could face an unreasonable rent hike that would put them at risk of eviction. The law, which was largely the result of the work done by Denise and her coalition, was hailed as a major step forward in the fight for affordable housing. As this new law was signed into effect, Denise watched with pride. She knew that it was the culmination of years of hard work, and she was grateful to see her vision for a more just and equitable housing system coming to fruition. But even as the ink dried on the law, Denise knew that the fight wasn't over. There was still so much to be done. The new law was only one piece of a much larger puzzle, and it would take continued effort to ensure that every renter in the country could live with the security and dignity they deserved. Denise's journey was now a model for others who wanted to make a difference. Young activists reached out to her for advice, eager to follow in her footsteps. She became a mentor to a new generation of leaders, teaching them not just how to fight the system, but how to change it. She emphasized the importance of persistence, community, and faith in the face of adversity. Denise had learned the hard way that change was never easy, but it was always possible if you were willing to stand up and speak out. Despite the successes she had achieved, Denise remained humble. She continued to work with local tenant groups, helping them organize protests and campaigns. She still attended community meetings, listening to the stories of those who had been affected by eviction and displacement. She knew that no matter how far her journey had taken her, she was just one part of a much larger movement. It was the people on the ground, those who lived through the hardships of eviction, who had made the real difference. Denise Carter's legacy was not just about the laws she helped pass or the recognition she received. It was about the lasting change she inspired in the hearts and minds of millions of people. Her fight had sparked a nationwide movement for housing justice, and her work would continue to affect generations to come. The courtroom was silent, save for the quiet murmurs of those watching. The anticipation was palpable, and all eyes were on the judge. The tension had been building for hours, the fate of the case hanging in the balance. At the heart of the drama was the governor of California himself, whose actions had led to the unfair eviction of Denise Carter. He had not just ignored the law. He had trampled on the basic rights of a citizen, and now he was about to face the consequences in a courtroom that had already seen countless twists and turns. Denise sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded in front of her, a mixture of nervous anticipation and resolute determination etched on her face. Behind her, the walls of the courtroom seemed to close in, as if the very air was thick with the weight of the case. The governor had tried every trick in the book to avoid facing the consequences of his actions. But now, it was all coming to a head. There was no escaping the truth. Judge Judy, ever the embodiment of fairness and no nonsense judgment, sat at the bench, her expression stern and unwavering. The governor had tried to stall, tried to shift the blame, but Judge Judy wasn't having it. She had made it clear from the start, no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. And today it would be proven once and for all. The courtroom had been packed, not just with reporters and legal professionals, but with everyday people who had been following the case from the very beginning. For many, this trial wasn't just about Denise. It was about something bigger. It was about justice for every person who had ever been mistreated, ignored, or unfairly targeted by those in power. Today, the scales of justice would be balanced. The final arguments were being made, and the room was hanging on every word. The governor's defense attorney argued that the eviction had been a necessary step, a bureaucratic decision made in the interest of public safety. But Judge Judy was having none of it. She had heard these excuses before, and they were nothing but a thin veil over a much deeper issue, the abuse of power and the systemic inequality that allowed it to thrive. Judge Judy's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding, as she addressed the defense. You can dress it up with all the legal jargon you want, but at the end of the day, it's clear what happened here. This was an abuse of power, and no one should be allowed to get away with it, not even the governor. The defense attorney stammered, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Judge Judy's words had cut to the heart of the matter. She turned to the plaintiff's side of the courtroom and looked at Denise. Her gaze was steady and reassuring. Ms. Carter, your fight is not just your own. You've stood up for so many who couldn't stand up for themselves. Today, we make sure that this never happens again. The room was still as everyone waited for the judge's final verdict. The governor's camp, once so confident, now seemed to shrink under the weight of the moment. The once mighty leader of California, now reduced to just another person facing the consequences of their actions. And then it happened. The words everyone had been waiting for. Judge Judy raised her gavel and slammed it down with authority. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Ms. Denise Carter. The actions of the governor were illegal and unjust. A full apology must be issued, and compensation for the wrongful eviction will be awarded. Furthermore, steps must be taken to ensure that this never happens again. The courtroom erupted in a mix of gasps, whispers, and applause. Denise's eyes welled up with tears as she heard the words she had fought for so long to hear. The governor's camp, however, looked stunned. They had expected a different outcome, but it was clear now that power and influence couldn't shield them from accountability. Denise stood slowly, her legs shaking as she rose to her feet. She had won. She had done it. The legal battle was over, but the work was far from done. As she walked out of the courtroom, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't just her victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever faced injustice. Her fight had sparked a movement, and now, that movement had changed the world. Outside the courtroom, the press were waiting. Cameras flashed as Denise stepped into the light. She was a symbol of resilience, of the power of the people to stand up and demand change. She knew that her story wasn't just about what had happened to her. It was about every person who had ever been wronged by the system. And it was a reminder that change was possible. Denise smiled, the weight of the years of struggle lifting as she took in the moment. She knew there was still more work to do, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace. Her journey had come full circle. She had gone from being an ordinary woman fighting for her rights to becoming a symbol of hope for millions. And as she walked into the future, she knew that her story had only just begun. In the years that followed Denise Carter's courtroom victory, her life changed in ways she could never have imagined. She went from being a local figure in California's tenant rights movement to a national icon for social justice. The case against the governor had made waves not just for the way it had exposed a powerful person's wrongdoing, but for how it had shifted the national conversation about housing, rights, and fairness. Denise became a fixture in policy discussions at the highest levels of government. Lawmakers from across the country sought her input as they crafted new laws to protect renters and tenants. Her influence reached far beyond California, and she knew that her work had the power to change the future for millions of people. Despite the accolades and media attention, Denise remained focused on the mission that had brought her to this point, protecting vulnerable tenants and ensuring that no one would ever face the kind of injustice she had. But now, more than ever, she understood the significance of her victory, not just for her own life, but for the lives of others who were still struggling against the same forces of inequality. Her victory in court had sparked changes in California, but it was her advocacy that ensured those changes continued to resonate. With the new tenant protection laws in place, she watched as more and more states began to follow California's lead. It was a testament to the power of grassroots movements, to the idea that one person, armed with nothing but their belief in justice, could start a wave of change that rippled across the entire country. Denise continued to work tirelessly with tenant organizations, pushing for further reforms and improvements. One of her main focuses became rent control, as she advocated for laws that would prevent landlords from raising rents to unsustainable levels. She saw firsthand how easy it was for people to lose their homes due to rapid, unpredictable rent increases. The law she had helped push for in California was just the beginning. There was still so much work to be done. As she traveled the country, speaking at rallies, conferences, and events, Denise saw the impact of her work in ways she had never expected. There were tenants who came up to her and shared stories of how her fight had inspired them to stand up against their own landlords. There were young activists just starting out who told Denise that her example had shown them that justice wasn't a pipe dream. It was something worth fighting for, no matter the odds. One day, Denise received a letter that made her pause. It was from a young woman named Maria, who had been following the case closely when she was living in an apartment in Texas. Maria had faced eviction after struggling to pay rent, and when she saw what Denise had done, she found the strength to take action against her own landlord. The letter was a thank you, but more importantly, It was a testament to how one person's courage could inspire an entire community. As the years passed, Denise continued to work alongside lawmakers, civil rights organizations, and tenant advocacy groups to push for stronger protections for renters. In some states, her efforts led to the creation of rent control laws. In others, she helped secure funding for legal aid services to help tenants fight against eviction. Every victory, big or small, was a step forward in the larger fight for housing justice. Her legacy wasn't just about the laws. She helped pass the high-profile victories in the courtroom. It was about the communities she touched and the lives she changed. Denise had fought for the rights of individuals, but she had also fought for the collective good of society. She had used her own experience of injustice to fuel a movement that would outlast her. As the country evolved and new challenges emerged, Denise remained steadfast in her mission. She knew that the fight for justice was never truly over. There would always be new battles to face, new injustices to address, and new people to inspire. But she also knew that the seeds she had planted would continue to grow. Denise Carter's name became synonymous with fairness, equality, and resilience. Her story wasn't just a testament to her own strength. It was a story for the millions of people who, like her, had fought back against a system that tried to keep them down. It was a story that would be remembered for generations to come. A story of justice served and a legacy that would continue to inspire.